everyone, this is Alicia, Opportunity Partners Community Outreach and Advocacy Manager, and I'm happy to bring to you today the June 2016 edition of the Advocates Broadcast. Joining me today is my colleague and friend, Anni Simons. Hi, Anni.
Hi, Alicia. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me today.
No problem.
So, Anni is a government relations specialist at Fredrikson and Byron, a law firm that represents many members of the disability community through lobbyist activities. Anni is a registered lobbyist, and I know that's a term that some might not be familiar with, or you might have some preconceived notions about lobbying. So Anni, can you tell us a little bit about your job?
Absolutely. So I think when some folks hear the term lobbyist, we often think a lot of large organizations or large corporations and companies that have to employ lobbyists to help them with their work at the Capitol, educating legislators about what it is they do. But the truth is, all sorts of different organizations need help spreading the message up at the Capitol about the work they do, including disability service providers. So as you mentioned a few moments ago, I specialize in representing disability service providers over at the Capitol. So it just means I help you all and others who are already working with their legislators to educate them about what the disability services are that they're providing and what some of the legislative issues are that they're facing.
And Anni's work is so integral to much of our advocacy efforts. So thank you, Anni, for all that you do to represent us up at the Capitol with elected officials. We really appreciate it.
It is a pleasure to work with you all. It's issues I'm really interested in and care about. So thanks for working with me as well.
Now, Anni is going to join us today specifically because we want to hear from her. We want her to share her expertise around what went down at the Capitol as the legislative session ended. As you may know, the session ended on Monday, May 23rd, and there was a lot of activity going on in the very final moments. And we want her to give us an update about the outcomes and where we're at with those several policy priorities that were included in Opportunity Partners' legislative agenda this year. So Anni, can you give us a little bit of an update about the disability waiver rate system? As you guys might remember, that's an initiative that would help make sure that payment rates for providers are equitable across the state. So where did we land with that, Anni?
Absolutely. So ever since the new rate system, as Alicia referenced, was put in place a couple years ago, each session, multiple pieces of legislation are introduced to kind of tweak that, work to strengthen it, work to make it really reflect the true cost of providing services. This year was no exception. There was multiple pieces of legislation introduced around DWRS. In the end, because this was a short legislative session and not a lot of money was spent, generally only pieces of legislation that had no cost passed. There were a few exceptions that I'll talk about later, but for DWRS, there was one piece of legislation that had no cost to implementing it, but it really requires the state to post a lot more data and information on their website about DWRS in terms of how much money is being spent through that new rate setting program, how many people are waiting to access services each month, how many new people are able to access services under that DWRS, and that sort of thing. So it will really help those of us who are trying to get a better handle on how well or not well is DWRS working. This data that will now be posted in a much more transparent way will help us really dig into what's happening.
Another one of our policy priorities that Anni was tracking this legislative session along with all of us was Minnesota's Olmstead Plan. Anni, was there any progress made with the Olmstead Plan?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, for the past couple years, a lot of us in the disability community have been paying close attention to and working on advancing the Olmstead Plan here in Minnesota. This year, what ended up passing was primarily just some funds that are allocated to different state agencies that really work on the kind of behind-the-scenes administrative tasks that are necessary to move Olmstead forward. So funds were passed to two different groups that do that. One is the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities, and the other is the Department of Human Services, which also have some staff that work on advancing that plan. I will say quickly about Olmstead, we have been in discussions with the state of Minnesota and other stakeholders that are working on that Olmstead Plan, and we have been hearing that next year will likely be a big year for legislation around Olmstead. I think there's already conversations and work going on about if we bring legislation forward next year as a community around Olmstead, what might that look like. But this year mostly focused on some small administrative needs to move that plan forward.
Well, we definitely hope to see more progress with Minnesota's Olmstead Plan because, as all of you know, advancing the quality of life for people with disabilities is core to our mission, and and increasing the level of inclusion for people in their communities is so important. And another piece of legislation that would aim to do that is the Home and Community-Based Services Incentive Pool that would provide funding for providers that really integrate people into their communities through employment, residential services, etc., where they want to live, where they want to work, how they want to be supported. So what went on with the HIP this year, Anni?
Yes, so this was initially passed into law last year, and funds were allocated that different groups could apply for to, just as Alicia said, work on projects that increase the community integration of Minnesotans with disabilities. This year what happened with HIP was that some kind of smaller technical language that was passed that allows that fund to exist long term, so it wouldn't be kind of a one-time pot of fund that's available. No additional money was added to the fund because, as we talked about before, there was not a lot of spending that went on this year, but there were some important small technical legislative changes made that ensure that one day down the road, when we are able to continue to allocate funds to that pool of money, that it'll be there, and different groups that are interested with various projects can apply for that. So it's still moving forward.
Good. So sometimes when we think of legislative success, we think of a big funding increase, we think of something major that happens that we can all rally around and celebrate. But sometimes it's important to remember that progress, positive progress at the legislature really takes time, and sometimes it happens little bit by little bit. And so one of the things that we saw a little bit of progress with was medical assistance reform, aiming to increase the spend down and asset limits for people accessing MA in the state of Minnesota. And one of the areas of progress that were made was raising awareness with legislators, having people share their really important, impactful stories about how this issue affects them, although we didn't see many legislative outcomes, did we, Anni?
We did not, unfortunately, see legislative outcomes on that. Unlike a couple of the other items that we just talked about where it was possible to make some improvements to them without any cost associated, with the spend down, it's a pretty simple, straightforward issue. We're working to have folks with disabilities be able to keep more money in their accounts on a monthly basis and on a yearly basis, and because of the technical way that works, it costs money to do that. So as Alicia referenced, I think we made great progress this year in terms of the hearings. We had multiple hearings on that issue, and some very powerful testimony was shared with legislators from individuals who are forced to live on very low amounts of income each month in order to continue to access their services. Powerful testimony was shared to educate legislators about how difficult that is, and so I think we positioned ourselves very well to come back next year, which is a year when we suspect more spending will take place, and to reconnect with those legislators who we educated this year and say, you remember hearing from Joe or Steve about how tough it is for him to try to continue to live independently when he's subject to such low income limits. Let's do something about that this year.
And another issue that we're going to be back at next session, working really hard and advocating for, is, of course, the Best Life Alliance. Anni, can you give us an update about that?
Absolutely. So hopefully you are all well aware of the Best Life Alliance. It's work that went on this session around rate increase for home and community-based service providers that Opportunity Partners was hugely involved in and very supportive of, along with lots of other disability and senior service organizations across Minnesota. Lots of time and energy was put into that this year, as you all have likely unfortunately heard by now. The money for that rate increase was not included in final budget negotiations. However, I think all of us who were involved in that work this year have had conversations in the past few days acknowledging the fact that for other issues we've worked on, often when the dust settles and the legislative session is over, we really feel like, oh, we could have done that differently if we had just more time. We could have targeted that additional legislator had we had the capacity. For this issue, we all, I think, absolutely feel like we did everything we could. Folks like you all and Opportunity Partners were amazing in terms of connecting with legislators out in your districts. We really feel like we put everything on the table in terms of connecting with every single legislator and educating them about what home and community-based disability services are, why they're facing a rate crisis and its impact on workforce, and what that means for quality of life of both those accessing services and also providing services.
Absolutely. And so we just thank everyone, all of the advocates and Opportunity Partners, the direct support professionals, self advocates, family members who spoke to elected officials about this issue. Whether you responded to an action alert, you made a phone call, wrote a letter to your legislator, or attended one of our many events at the Capitol, your presence, your voice was important and will make a difference in the long run, along with the work that folks like Anni are doing at the Capitol. So that wraps up this month's Advocates broadcast. I really just again want to thank all of you for your hard work throughout the legislative session. We know it's not easy, but we also know we're not going to give up. We also surely want to thank Anni Simons for all of her efforts on an ongoing basis, sharing again her expertise with us, and for joining me here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to echo what Alicia said. Thank you so much for all that you guys are doing. It's there's definitely need for lobbyists like me to connect with legislators about the services, but what is most important is those of you who are much closer to the services sharing your own stories, because that's the most powerful thing that legislators hear and think about when they have to make decisions about funding and policy. So thank you for all that you do on top of your already busy lives.
All right, everybody, that wraps up this month's Advocates broadcast. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.